Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. On the July 22nd, 2022, the Trudeau government announced a plan to reduce nitrogen emissions from fertilizer use. Canadian government's plan to reduce fertilizer-related emissions by 30% by 2030. The rationale is that this will help with the climate crisis. However, many provinces, such as Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario, are already crying foul and are urging the federal government to reconsider. Farmers are downright worried and angry. If met, these goals could decimate their income and would cause food supply to lower and prices to soar, which affects you, the consumer, at the grocery store. Just take a look around the world to see where similar policy was implemented and what happened afterward. In Sri Lanka, for example, they banned organic fertilizers and food production was cut in half. People, of course, started to riot. Or take a look at the Netherlands, where just this past summer, farmers revolted against a similar Dutch policy and protests blocked highways and cities for days on end. And is this surprising? When a policy is introduced which threatens one's livelihood, well, expect a reaction. So is this plan really necessary? Is fertilizer really a great threat to the environment? And what are the long-term consequences for farmers and you, the food consumer? Well, joining me now to unpack it all is former Canadian Minister of Agriculture, Gerry Ritz. Minister Ritz, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate having you back on again.
Well, you're going to get a backlash if you say minister. You have to say former.
Former minister. My apologies. Former minister. Exactly. So yeah, I'm glad you're joining me. You've spoken out about this issue, in the news, and I appreciate that. But many of our viewers may not fully understand this policy. So unpack it for us.
Well, it's been spun that it's somehow going to help them hit their climate targets. Nothing could be further from the truth, because the bigger the crop, the more carbon that's sequestered, and that's supposedly the target. The problem that we have, and as you mentioned in your run-up, Sri Lanka, they chased the president out of the country. In Holland, they were going to take 11,000 farms out of production to meet their goals. Guess what? Farmers started spreading manure in front of government offices and said, here's your fertilizer. And I think we need to do the same type of thing here in Canada. The biggest fertilizer spreader we have is Trudeau and his cabinet crew. They're going beyond their targets, but they're flying all over the world to make these goofy announcements and so on. And that flies in the face of what they say they're trying to do. The problem with attacking fertilizer is you're attacking a farmer's ability to do the best he can, the most efficient, effective, economical way to grow that product that Canadians need and that we export. 50% on average of what we grow and produce gets exported. That's a huge amount of money back into our GDP. At one point, agriculture was the third largest contributor to that GDP, with processing and so on. That's all going south because of the carbon tax for starters, and of course, a lot of other regulations that they're bringing on. There's no agricultural heroes at the cabinet table. Just followers that are going along with whatever Trudeau dictates that day. It's ridiculous.
So let's talk about this, though, for a moment, because there are those who are concerned about the environment. And so this policy has been put forward as perhaps a solution to one component of climate crisis. Is this true? Will this reduction of fertilizer-related emissions, will that actually help the climate?
Well, Canada is 1.6% of the global climate problem. Yes, there's a problem, but it's not us. 1.6%. That's a rounding error. Yes, we're doing better than we ever did. Farmers have already addressed this in the way that they farm their land, especially in Western Canada, these large tracts of land with continuous cropping, which means that carbon that's sequestered stays in the ground. It doesn't leach back out. They're given no credit for that at all. They operate their farms the most effective way they can. Fertilizer is a huge investment. They don't spread more than they need. They don't use more than they need. And they now do it in a way where they map the field with soil samples. That goes up to the cloud and then directs the GPS controls on their air seeders, their sprayers, their combines for that matter. And it then puts the right amount of product in the right place at the right time. So they're already following all these rules, but they get no credit for it unless they change the way they run their operation. That's ridiculous. There's no retroactivity in this program, only harm going forward.
Okay, I want to talk about that in a moment because, Canadians the agricultural sector is seen as being one of the more environmentally friendly in the world. And I want to talk about how, and as you suggested, it's maybe not being recognized by our own government, but maybe how it's seen around the world. We're going to unpack this and several other issues surrounding this potential fertilizer ban in just a few moments. We'll be right back. Welcome back. I'm joined by former Canadian Minister of Agriculture, Gerry Ritz, and we're discussing the recently introduced plan to reduce fertilizer-related emissions here in Canada. And of course, farmers and even consumers are up in arms about this. So, former Minister Ritz, Gerry, let's talk about Canadian farming practices. Of course, when we hear about the need to reduce fertilizer-related nitrogen, that's suggesting there is a problem. So I guess my question to you, is there an environmental problem with the way Canadian farmers farm?
Personally, I don't think so. Whether it's grains or livestock, Canadian producers have stepped up and they are environmental stewards of their land. I mean, no farmer wants to see his land despoiled by farming practices that do that. We used to do that. There were some that mined the soil. We had, 50% summer fallow. That's now gone. Everything's continuous cropping. There's crop cycles that now are 3 to 5 years long that put nutrients back in the soil. The next crop then takes advantage of those nutrients without having to put more on. Nitrogen is put back into the soil by any of the pulse crops, peas, beans, lentils, that type of thing, chickpeas. And then the next crop you'll grow on it will be wheat or durum because you want the higher protein that's driven from that nitrogen concentration. It's not so good for malt barley because you don't want a high protein content there. But farmers are making those decisions based on what's best for their bottom line. And they, as I said earlier, they don't buy extra fertilizer just to broadcast it on, hoping for more results. Everything is tested. And it's the right amount at the right place at the right time, and all these different rules that they've self-imposed that make them that efficient and that effective. The quality and consistency of supply of Canadian product is well known around the world. It made it very easy to sign up trade deals with a lot of other countries. Of course, the devil's in the legal details in those, but at the end of the day, Canadian product is still in huge demand, and we're having problems getting it to them with issues like that. That's the genesis of the concern in the U.S. A lot of what we produce goes down there for further processing. We buy some of it back, some of it hits the world stage. But if that starts to be questioned, that affects their job capabilities in the U.S.
Okay, well, we'll talk about actually how that would impact our U.S.-Canadian relations in a moment. But in terms of how Canada is seen, because, here we have the Prime Minister suggesting this is a problem, and you've done a very good job of eloquently explaining, well, it probably isn't a problem. But how are our farming practices seen globally? Our products are excellent, but is Canada known as a big polluter in the way we manage our farmland?
No, we're not. One of the great opportunities that we had when I was minister was what was called a new crop tour, and industry and government officials and so on, the grading agencies like Crop Commission and so on, they traveled the world after the crop was off, telling them what we had, how good it was, what the specs would be on it if they were looking to buy. And the heroes, the front bench of all of that were the farmers themselves talking about the way they farm, using pictures and videos and so on, showing how we cover the land, why we do it this way and so on. And that was always the big draw for these buyers internationally. So no, Canadian farmers are well thought of globally in the way that they produce this product. Okay,
and again, we touched upon the U.S. Is the U.S. introducing a similar policy?
No. No one is.
What other G7 nation is? Do you know of any G7 nation that is doing this?
No, I don't. A lot of them, in Japan, a rural vote counts for 2 against an urban vote, so they don't lose their agricultural sector. You got programs like that do disproportionately change things. But at the end of the day, they're all there to enhance as much product as they can to feed their people. China stockpiles unbelievable amounts of product so that they'll never have a hunger again. But they're starting to realize that they've got to start dealing with other countries, and they do. They buy a lot of product from Canada at times. We have to be cautious how we trigger that trade corridor, but at the end of the day, they're a willing buyer and they pay a premium. We've got countries like South Korea, Japan, and others that want that traceability right from the field to the fork, and we can offer that. We use blockchain capacities and so on, and able to further that end. It gives a premium product back to the farm. But there should also, on that same supply chain, be a reverse trigger that takes the carbon credits back to the farmers that are storing that carbon. And right now, we're getting absolutely no use for it and no verification that we're doing that great role.
So are farmers paying carbon tax on their crops, for example?
Huge. They get a little bit of money back on fuel, but there's every other layer of delivery. It's like everybody saying there's no tax on groceries. Wrong. Every step along the way has a carbon tax applied. Anything that handles or processes or transports or stores has a carbon tax on it. That all gets added onto your grocery bill.
My goodness. And so I understand then when you're saying that, if they're actually capturing and retaining the carbon in the soil, then there should be a credit for that. I could understand why the farmers would argue for that. We've got to cut to commercial break. And when we get back, we're going to talk about if this is going to put us at a competitive disadvantage globally, and more so what this means for you, the consumer. Will you see an increase in food prices yet again? Stick around. Welcome back. I'm joined by former Canadian Minister of Agriculture, Gerry Ritz, and we're discussing the new introduced plan to limit fertilizer-related emissions here in Canada. So the question I have is, because we share such a large border and we're a great trading partner with the United States, like with the carbon tax, the question always remains is, are we going to be put at a competitive disadvantage then with our American siblings south of the border? Is that a concern, Gerry?
Well, the short answer is yes. The problem is all of those costs end up at the farm gate and make them less effective in the way that they market their product. So it is a concern, absolutely. We saw a huge turmoil at the border with the ArriveCan app. Nobody understood how to make that work for them. With the same thing with vaccination of truckers, created all of that convoy, and rightly so. They were pushing back, and it's led to the lifting of some of those mandates. They're not gone. They're just held back for now. So there's still lots of work to be done. There's growing concern in the U.S. that somehow Canada has gone beyond woke. We're going broke. And if we do, we'll drag them into that vortex as well because of the interdependency. For a lot of farmers, the border doesn't exist. They have land on both sides. And, on one side, they're allowed to do certain things. Other side, they're not. And in the end, that crop might be stored on one side or the other, and it might be produced on one side or the other. It really doesn't matter. And at the end of the day, with the trade agreements that we have, whatever you call it, NAFTA 2.0, Kuzma, whatever, that damn Trump, however you want to label it, at the end of the day, they're very concerned about how far crazy we go. We just saw Italy respond to a lot of the wokeness that was in their government. They've elected a woman now who says she's going to turn everything on its ear and start over. Good for her. And it probably needs to be done. I remember being at a G20 meeting in Paris, and Sarkozy was the president at the time. He's like 5'0" in his lift shoes and all attitude and ego. And he spoke to us about the growing need for more regulation on agriculture in France and how they were going to regulate the crap out of their farmers and make them do this and make them do that. And when we had our meeting after, I was the only one that spoke against that. And then Tom Vilsack, who was the ag secretary then, and still is, backed me up and said, this is crazy. Farmers are the most effective, efficient people in the world. They're masters of their own destiny. Leave them alone. And when we had our reception later, Sarkozy refused to shake my hand. And I, as he walked away, Tom said, "There, you've been snubbed." And I said, "I've been snubbed by better people." And of course, he took that to heart too. But at the end of the day, you cannot beat farmers into line. Sri Lanka showed us that. Holland showed us that. And, I have some concern with some of the operations in Canada now. They all have their own lobbyists. And a lot of them buy these big name people in Ottawa, and all they want is their
let's talk about the farmer response.
Validated.
Because, again, from what I understand, the U.S. is not looking to impose a similar fertilizer ban, if you will.
No.
But the Netherlands is, and they're in the process of doing this. And
the Netherlands isn't necessarily talking about a fertilizer ban. They're talking about their energy use down by taking 11,000 farmers out of business.
Right.
That's a different situation altogether.
That's a lot of farmland, and that's a lot of business.
Oh. Well, Holland's not that big. I mean, my riding was damn near that size. So, I mean, they're very effective, very efficient.
And so what has the response been from the farmers? I mean, of course, we've seen the visuals and we've seen the video clips, but has it died down, or are people still upset, or what's going to happen?
I think like everything, a week in the media is a big thing. They're looking for the next big headline, so they've moved on. But certainly from everything that I ascertain and hear about on Twitter from colleagues over there and so on, it hasn't stopped. The government hasn't backed off. Our government here, though, when they first got some pushback on this crazy idea of forcing farmers to do things differently, all of a sudden, Minister Bibeau comes out and says, oh, it's voluntary. Well, it's just like the voluntary gun buyback. Now it's not voluntary anymore. So nobody trusts them. Nobody believes what they're saying because they're making this up on the back of a napkin as they go along.
So if it is voluntary, as you've just shared, are there farms that are actually actively participating? Will they participate?
Well, by their actions, they've been participating for 20 years, in going to direct seeding and air seeders and GPS coordinates that control what spray goes on and what fertilizer goes on in certain areas. They've already been doing it, but they're getting no credit for it. The carbon sequestration is beyond belief. In different crops, it's different numbers. On rangeland, it's different, but it's all there. Any growing thing sucks in carbon.
So why don't they get credit then? I know you're talking about like they have to pay carbon taxes and they're not getting the carbon credit for what they're recovering, but why not?
Well, the ledger's only got a cost page on it, not an income page, and that has to be changed. I've tried to work with our government here in Saskatchewan on a carbon buyback program. They have the ability. One of the first things I said is the province needs to designate carbon a provincial resource, and then they control it, not the federal government. They went to the Supreme Court. Of course, it ruled that the federal government has the right to levy taxes, which they do, but that's got nothing to do with the carbon tax. This is a tax on prosperity.
Okay, we're going to be right back in just a moment. Welcome back. We're wrapping up our discussion on the newly introduced plan to limit fertilizer and reduce the emissions by 2030 by our federal Canadian government. And joining me again is a former Canadian Minister of Agriculture, Gerry Ritz. Gerry, most of our viewers are not farmers. Most of us maybe don't live in the rural country. I do now, and I really enjoy watching the crop rotation of which you speak. However, one thing that we all do is we consume food. We all need food.
Absolutely.
And this is what our farmers are producing. They're producing crops and food and all those things. How will this plan impact the average Canadian consumer?
In the short term, they will see less selection. In the mid to long term, they'll see prices go up. Less product available. The marketplace says we're going to charge you more for it. The problem is it won't be the farmer that gets that. So, there's already spin out there saying it's the farmer's costs that are going up and they're passing it on. A glass of milk, 17 cents of it goes to the dairy guy. The other $2 goes to the restaurant. And of course, the waiter wants a bigger tip than 17 cents on that. So there's always been that disparity. And at the end of the day, it's consumers that will be paying for these types of egregious government programs. At the end of the day, we import a tremendous amount of our product, and you start putting carbon taxes and other things. I mean, what's next in their toolkit to try and get to this net zero thing they're talking about, which is impossible when we're only 1.6% of the global problem. But it's consumers and the agricultural producers themselves on either end of the scale that will pay the price for this government largesse.
Now, we of course can anticipate that there will be an increase in the cost of food that we've seen already with inflation, and then of course with these new, I don't know, taxes. I don't know what you want to call them.
Well, you got a tripling of the carbon tax just announced the other day. That was the NDP got their dental program for, maybe one kid out of 100. And at the end of the day, the carbon tax went up 3 times. So, it was a nasty bill.
But when you say there's going to be less product available, why would this fertilizer program ban, if you will, the fertilizer ban, why would that lead to fewer product or less product?
Well, fertilizer, anybody who has plants in their house, they'll put a little bit of dab of fertilizer in every once in a while to keep them green and growing. And that's exactly what happens with crops. You put on fertilizer with the crop, you top dress, you work it accordingly. But at the end of the day, it's all about production. It's all about volume. And if you're not going to use the amount of fertilizer that you think you're going to need because of these egregious restrictions, then you're going to get less product in the bin.
So we will have less quantity of food in this country produced.
Well, like I say, we export half of what we produce. The problem will be you'll have less selection. There'll be certain things that'll be grown, but not others because they take less fertilizer to begin with.
I see.
And at the end of the day, we're not going to see bread lines or anything like that because we do produce enough. But our problem will be our status in the world will be shaken to the core. Right now, we're a quality, consistent producer of top shelf goods. There are big flour mills. One in Jakarta comes to mind. It uses 10% Canadian wheat in order to blend with all the other crap they buy from around the world to make a cheaper bread. So that will be missing. That will be gone.
Wow. Now, again, we saw what happened in Sri Lanka, right? There's an example of where there was a similar ban, and the farm, and it wasn't just farmers, it was the average consumer. The prices just skyrocketed for food. And, with, of course, regular inflation and COVID inflation, whatever you want to call it, now with this new measure, could we foresee similar rioting?
Well, we saw, a very polite Canadian riot with the trucker convoy in Ottawa. I think you could certainly see more of that type of thing. Farm equipment, trying to make their point. And of course, that's spun in the media now. That's very Trudeau-esque friendly in that farmers are blocking the roads for consumers, but they're trying to help consumers make an educated decision by highlighting the threat that they're under and the threat that consumers are ultimately under. And I thank you for raising this issue in your broadcast, because the national media that we have is so tied to their paychecks that come through taxpayers' funds that they're not covering this type of thing like they should be.
Well, I think seeing the footage from Sri Lanka and the Netherlands this past summer really woke me up. We were in the lazy days of summer. You're not paying attention to the news cycle so much. And I saw that. I said, my goodness. And then to hear on the heels of that we were now implementing a policy, it made me wonder, well, is this the good direction? Is this where we should be heading? I mean, there's so many questions to answer. And I think you've done an excellent job. Former Canadian Minister of Agriculture, Gerry Ritz, thank you again for joining me today on the show.
My pleasure. Anytime.
Thank you. Of course, many Canadians are concerned about the environment, and climate is really top of mind for them. But is this the right policy direction in which Canada should be going? It sounds like various parts of the world that have implemented similar policies, it hasn't fared so well. And of course, as you head to the grocery store this fall and perhaps next spring, you may see an elevated grocery bill. Is that what we want to achieve here? For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.